Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Lost Voice program, where we explore the importance of classical philosophy in the faith, the family, and the world. I am your host, John Studi, along with my co-host and friend, Jacob Nelson. Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing, John?
Oh, I'm doing fairly well. It's been a great week so far. And today, one thing I want to talk about that is absolutely just all over our society, all over our world, is this concept of moralistic therapeutic deism, which we touched on a little bit in the last episode. But just as a reminder for our listeners, could you remind us what moralistic therapeutic deism is and give us a little example of what that means?
Yeah, if we break down the concept of moralistic therapeutic deist, the moralist part of it is that God wants us to do good things. That, I think the philosopher Schleiermacher kind of summed it up in prayer is doing nothing more than good works. So as long as we're generally a good person, John's looking at me like he's never heard this before.
I've never heard that quote.
Well, it's not a quote from him. It summarizes his idea of. But his idea of prayer is to simply do good things, because he himself would say that God is unknowable, and since he's unknowable, he doesn't really exist. But we should act, if the idea of prayer is acting as if God does exist, and so we should do good things. I know, it's ridiculous, but that's why we're talking about this, because philosophy doesn't always make sense. I mean, good philosophy does, but
sophistry doesn't.
Bad philosophy doesn't make any sense. The moralistic and moralistic therapeutic deist is that we're supposed to just do good things. The therapeutic part is that, God is there to comfort us. He's there to take care of us. So much of our prayer is petitionary prayer, which is good. We should petition in our prayers, but God is much more than a divine vending machine where we stick our prayer in and get out what we want. The therapeutic part of this is that God is a feel-good God. That he simply wants us to feel good, or he wants to take care of us when we're not. And then the deist part of it, John, I think you summarized it well last week, in that a theist is one who understands that God is a personal God. He wants to interact in our history. A deist is more one who sees God as setting the world into motion and then stepping back and letting it go. So a moralistic therapeutic deist, in summary, is somebody who does good work, but when they're suffering, they might go to God or seek comfort in God, and that's the only time they really go to God. And the deist part of it is that God really just sets things into motion and lets the world spin. I think we see this pretty common in our world today, I'm a good person because I haven't murdered somebody. I'm a good person because I haven't robbed a bank. I'm basically good. Well, are you? I mean, John, if you came to me and I said, John, are you really, tell me of your Christian walk. Tell me how you act based on your belief in God. And you'd say, well, I'm basically good. I mean, I don't kill, I don't cheat, I don't steal. Is that really being Christian? I mean, come on. Isn't God more than simply a moralistic therapeutic deist or deism or deity?
Oh, right. I mean, if we believe that God is love, which I think most moralistic therapeutic deists would say is, and love is acting and willing the good of the beloved, then if God has a hands-off approach to creation, except when we specifically want him, then I don't really think that he loves us. And so they might have a misunderstanding of what it means to love, or a misunderstanding of God, or more than likely both.
Well, love in this world is, feeling good. It's helping the other feel good. It's all about feeling. And we see this all over the place with these silly protests about things that, they protest this, they protest that on college campuses, and they can't even tell you why they're protesting half the time. Why are you burning the cars? Well, because I'm angry. Well, what are you angry about? Well, I don't know. Donald Trump.
Good answer. It really is.
They don't actually make an argument or a cogent argument about things. It's just they want to feel better. So yeah, it pervades our society. The idea of love is about feeling good.
Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of negative approach to goodness is revealed in our. Have you ever seen those coexist bumper stickers where it says, the C is like from the crescent of Islam, the O is something else, and the T is a cross. That's almost like the buzzword or the slogan of our culture is coexist, tolerate, be with one another.
Which, by the way, I know you're going somewhere with this, but isn't the word tolerate so condescending?
Yes, absolutely.
We need to tolerate everybody. Well, that means that I'm putting up with you even though I can't stand you.
Right, which is largely the basis of our relationship, and so we actually excel at the virtue of tolerance. And that's a different thing, too. Is that the word tolerance has been transformed to acceptance, which we're going to talk about words and definitions and terms a little later, but putting that aside for now, just think about, apply that to your relationship with like your wife or your best friend. If I came up to you and asked you, how's your relationship with Sarah? And you said, well, we tolerate one another and we coexist. I haven't committed adultery, with somebody else today, and I haven't cheated on my spouse. I haven't murdered her yet, and she hasn't killed me either, which in itself is some sort of miracle.
That would be a pretty interesting show, though, if she had killed me and I'm still here talking.
It would be. I think actually, Dr. Mahfoud, the guy who owns the program, owns WCAT. He was telling me about how they have one program where the host has actually been dead for a few years, and
they're still recording.
They're still recording, and they're still broadcasting.
Well, not still recording, but broadcasting.
Yeah, broadcasting episodes, and so we can do that with you, or we can splice together the words and make you say new things, put words in your mouth, post-mortem, which would be very scary.
Yeah.
Coming back to haunt the airwaves of all of our listeners' radios. Anyway, we digress to some sort of horrible place. Moving on, if you simply said that you are tolerating and coexisting with your wife, I don't really think that's a very good example of a relationship. I don't think you would have a good relationship just by the negative.
Yeah, I feel like that wouldn't go over well. And we'll talk about it. I think we should probably do one episode all on marriage.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But it would probably not get to the 4 pillars of marriage of total, free, fruitful, and faithful.
Right.
If we just tolerate each other.
Right. I mean, there's times when you have to be honest. And you tolerate something, you tolerate the bad for the sake of the good. And so you're putting up with the rain because you know that it's going to have a beautiful rainbow at the end, or it's going to water your lawn or whatever.
Sure.
And so in the same way, you tolerate something bad that's happening for the sake of the good of the person.
Yeah.
Particularly, with your spouse. Anyway, moving on from that, I think that this idea of tolerance and coexisting, and this idea of negative goodness, which is a contradiction in terms. You speak about classical philosophy, and we can talk about that at a later point too. But it makes it so that in order to be a good person, you don't actually have to do anything.
Right.
And
you just have to not do other things.
You just have to not do other things, and that goes back to what we were talking about before about how we have this entertainment culture where engaging our mind, or engaging our mind in the news or whatever, it needs to be entertaining. That's mostly receptive, and there is less focus on the active intellect. And so in the same way, there's a lack of willing to actually go out and do the good.
Right. So the negative good here is that I'm a good person if I don't do anything wrong.
Right.
So I just have to not do certain things. Well, then the best way to be good is I'll just sit on my couch and watch TV.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I'm not doing evil things out in the world.
Right,
That's
exactly.
awesome.
I mean, we're obviously taking this to kind of an extreme here and making fun of it a little bit.
Yeah, but I think taking arguments to an extreme,
right.
Not that people adhere to the extreme,
sure.
but if we take them to the extreme, we can more easily see the lunacy or fallacy.
Right, reductio ad absurdum.
Right.
Bringing things to their ultimate end and showing how the premises lead to absurd conclusions.
But I would say, actually, in this case, some people do adhere to that extreme. I mean, you think about people who all they do is sit at home and play video games, and you ask them if they're good. I mean, I'm talking about from the aspect of youth ministry. Mm-hmm. Kids sit at home and they play video games. They don't do anything else, really. Some kids, that is. And you say, well, are you good? Are you a good person? Do you feel like you're a good Catholic? Well, yeah. why?
Right.
You don't do anything. You sit there and play games. You don't study. You don't do good works. You don't do the things that the church has asked you to do in terms of preparation for, say, confirmation. But you're saying you're good because all you've done is just not done some grave evil, other than to your own mind for being lazy.
Right, and that's one of the funny things. I remember at the beginning of this year, I sent out a survey to all the kids to kind of get a finger on the pulse of where their spiritual life was and see how strong their spiritual heart was beating, and had to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of their spiritual life. And I said 1 was like just a raging atheist who hates God and the world, and then on the high end was Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And there's one kid who rated himself a 7 or an 8, and when I asked them,
and I would guess the average is probably about a 7.
Yeah, 5 to 7 was usually what I got.
Yeah.
And his explanation for it was, I try to make it to Mass every weekend, and I pray before meals.
and that's a 7 or an 8.
Right, and
that's real close to Mother Teresa.
Yeah, that's like somebody who is just somebody who's astoundingly reacting to the graces of God. I mean, even myself, I study the faith, I pray daily, I teach the faith, and I wouldn't rate myself more than like a 6.
I would say, I do pretty much the same job you do in my day job. My night job as a radio host is something else. Hopefully we're doing something good there. I would say I'm like a 3. I mean, you think about the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a St. John Paul the Great. I'm nowhere near him.
Oh, absolutely not.
Not in my education, not in my faith life, not in my prayer life, nothing. Like, I am nowhere near John Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I could not feel intellectually honest by saying that I'm above a 5 on that scale.
Right. Which is, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And the odd part is, the more I do study and the more I do learn about the spiritual life, I recognize how far I am from its ideal.
So the more you study, the worse you become?
Yeah.
It's the worse you feel, anyway, because you come to know more.
Oh, there's an equivocation example in Dr. Kreef's book on logic. It was like the more you know, the less you remember. The more you learn, the more you know. Therefore, the more you learn, the less you remember, and therefore, the less you know. And I'm like, hold on a second. And so that's the same way there. The more we go into spiritual life, the worse we get.
Yeah.
But obviously, the assessment then, or the answer to that is no. It's not so much that we actually become worse. It's just we recognize our faults and our the places where we're lacking our character. It's like seeing a mirror more clearly as opposed to just kind of like glancing at it.
I was talking to a priest recently who had done spiritual direction for a group of sisters, and the one novice had come up and, Father, I don't think I can be a sister. The more I pray, the longer I'm here, I feel like the worse I'm becoming. And Father said, "Oh, sister, you are that bad. You're just coming now to realize it." And it's true with our study and our prayers. The more we learn, the more we not just learn about the external world, but the state of our internal heart.
Right.
Well, maybe I am, in fact, that bad. But, have hope.
Of course.
Once we have knowledge, we can do something about it. This actually goes to Paul VI and his document Ecclesiam Suum, that we need to arouse an awareness of ourselves in order to have a conversion.
Right.
Well, the greater the awareness, the greater the conversion. So have hope. It's not all dark and gloomy.
It is. Yeah, it is certainly not all dark and gloomy. But I just thought it was funny that the way he defined himself as a 7 or 8, and I think it reveals how little he knows actually about the spiritual life and what it takes to really live the Catholic faith. Is he even said that he doesn't go to confession yearly, or he doesn't read the Bible, or he doesn't pray daily beyond like a meal prayer. And most of these kids don't even know things like the what are they called? The precepts of the church.
Right.
The things that we're required to do.
Which one of them is going to confession
Yearly, yeah. or whenever there's a grave sin.
Right.
And so just very interesting that he rated himself so highly when the objective fact of the matter is that he's barely living the Catholic life.
Yeah.
And as the years progress, I mean, he's a nice guy and everything, but he hasn't really been paying attention in confirmation. I can tell there was very little effort to grow in the spiritual life outside of that.
But, niceness is not a virtue.
No, nice is not a virtue.
Kindness
absolutely is. In fact, there's I forget the exact words in the Greek, but there's an etymological difference between niceness and kindness, where niceness actually is related to the word naivety, and so there's a certain amount of stupidity to it, whereas kindness is actually related to a word that means like usefulness.
Yeah.
And so kindness is doing something good for the sake of the other, and whereas niceness can be in a lot of ways ignoring faults that need to be fixed in yourself or others, or being overly permissive with certain sins, either in yourself or others. Yeah. But kindness, on the other hand, is more closely related to love because it actually brings about the good of the beloved or the self.
Right. Yeah. Well, and again, not to despair in our youth. John and I work with young people every day. And there's a lot of bright spots. We're hoping that perhaps this summer we can broadcast, at least recorded, if not live, from our summer camp, Extreme Faith Camp. So stay tuned for that. It's the last week of June, so we have a few ideas about having kids talk to you about philosophy.
It's going to be great. It's going to be like one of those the darndest thing. Kids say the darndest things. Bill Cosby, whoever did that show. But just to uplift our youth in at least one regard, one of the things that sets apart millennials from Generation Xers or Boomers or the Silent Generation is that there is a lot of emphasis on social justice and in a good way, and so they do a lot of volunteering to feed the poor and help the homeless. In fact, I had an event recently where I had about 20 teenagers come to help out with homeless teens in Bloomington. We collected clothes and food and a whole bunch of supplies to help out those who are in need, and that was something that kids were very, very enthusiastic about. And that's just the norm in our culture among the youth, to really have a love for helping the poor and the needy, which is an absolutely beautiful thing. Yeah,
that is. But again, if we simply keep God in the realm of moralistic, therapeutic deist, to some degree, it doesn't matter how much you help the poor and needy. I mean, we do need to do that as Christians. We need to do that simply as humans, really. But my question to kids frequently when they say, "Well, I'm basically good. I haven't done any evil," or even if they go so far as to say, "Well, I help out at a soup kitchen once a week." Mm-hmm. My question always is, well, how does that make you as a Christian different from a Red Cross volunteer?
Oh.
Rarely can they answer that.
Right.
And there's nothing against Red Cross volunteers, but that doesn't get to the heart of the question of Jesus, who do you say that I am? Mm-hmm. Which is a question we all need to answer.
Right, and that's one of the things in the Gospels that I absolutely love. Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for making a big show out of their works, and he also talks about when you pray, don't do it in public like the Gentiles and everything. Don't make a big show out of it because their glory, their reward is right there with the glory of man. And then earlier in the gospel, he talks about how when we do our good works, we should let our light shine before men. And sometimes people point to that as a contradiction.
Right.
But the difference is that in the first case, when somebody goes out and proclaims all these things and does this stuff, it's for the sake of themselves.
Right.
Looking at the reward. Whereas when Jesus is talking about our good works, so that we may glorify the Father. And so one of the things that makes Christian good work distinctive from the good work of somebody, a Red Cross volunteer or whatever it may be, is that the Christian does his best to try to take the focus off of himself when other people see it, mm-hmm. and they offer up glory to God. Right. And that points them to the source of all love, all truth, all happiness, ultimately the good of our very being, to actually encounter God. And when the Christian does good works, what we need to remember is what Pope Benedict says in Deus Caritas, asked regarding charitable works and welfare and social needs. He says that it's important for us to remember when, and I'm summarizing here, it's important for us to remember that when we are talking about taking care of the needs of the poor and the helpless and the downtrodden, that we make sure that they're not just given bread, they're not just given clothes, because man does not live on bread alone. And they need that personal encounter with Christ to really satisfy the depths of their being. And so I think the best answer, or at least a very good beginning for an answer for what makes a Christian different when they perform these acts of charity, is that they give the glory to God for the sake of bringing that person to a higher good than simply the goods of the body that they're giving them.
Yeah, that's very true. And, we talked about that last week in a number of areas, one of which is understanding our faith better. We give glory to God and in our works and in what we do. But really, in order to give glory to God, we must also love God. And to love God is also to know God. And to know and love God is also to know and love our faith. And so we have an obligation to better understand the philosophy, the theology of the church, insofar as we're able. Of course, reading St. Thomas Aquinas is not for everybody. But, for those among us that can contemplate the truth that Aquinas brings, we have an obligation to bring that truth then to those beyond the scope of Aquinas. John, you and I do this with youth all the time. We try and bring Thomistic truth to teenagers, and they get it. We're not reading straight out of the Summa Theologia, but we do take the principles out of it. One of the sets of things that we talked about last week, very briefly, or at least we alluded to talk about this week, is the idea of the Trivium within classical education. And the reason why we brought that up last week, and we want to talk about it more this week, is because last week we were talking about the three ways that philosophy can give power to evangelization. Nice article, well, I should say a kind article, not a nice article, a kind article that Dr. Alexander Schipp wrote. And the three goods, again, just as a reminder, is the internal good of our own heart, the external good of how we can then proclaim it to others, and then an adequate anthropology so we can best understand, or at least better understand, the people around us and how they can receive truth. In order to really speak about that, I thought maybe talking about the Trivium would be a great opportunity because it corresponds nicely to these three ways of philosophy. The Trivium is the first step in a classical education. It lays the foundation for the Quadrivium. Trivium is Latin for the three ways, or the three roads and where they meet. And actually you could draw a nice shield of the Trinity, which I won't describe too in depth here, but you could look it up online by searching the Trivium, and oftentimes you'll see a shield of the Trinity come up. The Trivium is broken into three parts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which corresponds to the
three acts of the mind.
Three acts of the mind. And so we're just going to go through it a little bit. We're going to learn a little bit about grammar, a little bit about logic, a little bit about rhetoric, which of course gives us fodder for all kinds of episodes in the future. You can always email or on some shows we'll take call-ins to talk about things. So as we go through these things, write down some questions, write down some areas that you might want us to talk about more on future episodes. Email us. You can find the proper email on the website of En Route Books and Media. I don't know if I have the...
For WCAT.
For WCAT, yeah.
Yeah, there's a link. There should be a link on En Route.
Yep, on En Route, WCAT Radio. If I don't have the address right, just go in the old Google machine and you can find it.
The Google machine knows all.
The first step of the Trivium is grammar. Grammar. What do words mean? It's a favorite phrase of mine when I'm working with kids and they just start talking and I stop and I say, words mean things. And then they have to think about what I mean by the words they just said. It's quite entertaining. But words mean things. We talked last week, we brought up words, I should say, substance, accidents, and so on. But really words mean things. And we've talked about argumentation and entering into dialogue with people, and I think the Trivium really gets at this again, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Rhetoric, that being argumentation, learning how to state your position well and argue for it. You can't do that without grammar, and so getting to the root of defining our terms. But grammar correlates to that first benefit of philosophy within evangelization, the internal formation of our heart, of our soul, of our mind. And so, John, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on grammar and the first level of the mind, the first act of the mind.
No, right. Well, the first act of the mind is simple apprehension, and so it's having an understanding of what things are, and then you assign a particular term to it. So you can come to know what. I think one of the clearest examples is the difference between a living thing and a not living thing. We know the difference between a corpse and a cow, whereas the corpse has just no unity that it's really acting towards.
A steak is delicious.
A steak is absolutely delicious, not when it's well done. You ask if you're having a grilling party and they ask for a well done steak, you ask them politely but firmly to leave.
Well, we should probably then if you're going to recommend something that's not well done, we should put in that little disclaimer that's at the bottom of every menu: eating and consuming raw meats or undercooked meats is dangerous to your health, blah, 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 blah. Et
cetera, et cetera. And I am not a doctor and cannot advise you on any medical decisions you may or may not make.
But for the sake of your palate.
For the sake of your palate, medium rare is, pretty darn good. But so what's absolutely important for us to even begin to make steps towards reasoning is for us to understand the world as it is. Otherwise, our reasoning has nothing to really work with. It doesn't have the matter by which you can form judgments or propositions, and if we can't form propositions, we can't really make arguments properly. Right. We can express ourselves in a mode, but that's about the extent.
We know the word tree corresponds to that thing outside growing tall with leaves and branches and other things, and we know that tree is a tree and not, say, a dog.
Right. We know what it is according to its essence or its nature.
And the word helps signify that.
Yeah, and the word helps signify that in our mind, because being not things that can transmit thoughts through the ether, we have to use our words to provide a certain amount of matter to transmit the form or the nature or the idea of what a tree or a dog or a desk is. Now, one thing that is very often the case is that we don't necessarily have an extremely clear understanding of what a tree is. We usually will have a very vague understanding of it.
Right.
In a lot of ways, the things that are most clearly known to us are the ones which are least articulate. For example, my son right now, this is both in terms of like order of thought and also order of intellectual development. My son right now knows what a choo-choo is. He knows that it's that big loud thing that moves past our house that you say bye choo-choo to, or hi choo-choo, and that's about all he knows. He has no idea what it's for. He has no idea what the cars are and how it moves. He just has this unarticulate idea of that is a choo-choo. What does it mean to be a choo-choo? Well, I'm not sure.
A train, just to be clear.
A train.
I need to associate a word to it for my own good.
There you go. Thank you, Jacob. He's actually recently started calling it a train, which is very interesting that he's starting to change his term for that same concept. But again, my son doesn't really have a very clear understanding of what that is, and so we'll say things like justice. Well, we all have this vague understanding of what justice is, and what's really interesting is if you read Socrates, the Platonic dialogues, when they start trying to figure out like what is the definition of this term, they start offering all these examples, but they never really get to it. It's the same thing with youth. Whenever I ask a youth like what is justice, they just offer me examples. It's like when I treat my neighbors fairly when I do X, Y, and Z, or it's giving people equal rights, like in the civil rights movement or whatever it might be, and they give a particular example of it, or they give an aspect of it rather than the totality of what it means. And so it's exceedingly important for us to really examine the meanings of words, not just words that we make up and assign to reality, but give them make words which correspond to the reality of things that are external to the mind, if we're ever going to really start talking about the truth of the world, rather than just the expression of what we think the world is. And so it's very important for us to start with an examination of what we understand, with simple apprehension, understanding the nature of things, and getting to know those things in a more intimate way.
Right, so we need to, what I've come across with youth is similar to what you're saying, is that they're great at giving examples, they're great at living out the particulars, but as far as the synderesis goes, they have no idea. Synderesis being the kind of the universal first principle. So they can talk about the particular of justice.
Right.
I mowed my neighbor's lawn for free because she's elderly and whatever. That's great. Well, that'd probably be more like charity. You mowed the neighbor's lawn because she paid you. There, justice.
Sure, there you go.
But they can't really tell you the first principle, the synderesis, the coming together of what is that first principle that binds together justice in terms of doing good for your neighbor, doing good for the government doing what's right for you. Well, grammar helps here. The definition of the term being to give to another what is due to them. That is justice. And if we can lead people to these first principle terms, it helps them better understand the particulars.
Sure.
And when I teach moral theology to high schoolers, they always want to jump, or middle schoolers, they always want to jump into the Anne Frank question: can you lie to the Nazis? Well, we can talk about particulars, but it's not going to help us understand justice any better. It's not going to help us understand our duty to government any better if we're only looking at particulars, and so we have to look at the first principle of what is justice. And so grammar helps us do that. Again, this kind of goes back to the article that we spoke about last week. The first good of learning philosophy is just that internal formation.
Right.
And so in this case, we learn grammar. It's that internal formation of understanding the world, the reality, and so it helps us encounter truth. Well, since we're on the topic of grammar, John, what is truth?
Truth, you can think of it in two ways. I'm going to talk about it in the way we're probably looking at it here. If a man says of a thing that it is, and it is not, then that person does not speak truth. But if a man says of a thing that it is, and it is, then that person does speak truth. Is more or less what Aristotle says about truth and falsehood. And you can flip it around too. If a man says that thing is not when it is not, then he speaks truth. And he says that a thing is not when it is, then he does not speak truth.
So simply put,
truth in terms of our speech and understanding is the mind's accordance with reality, or the mind's conformity to reality.
Right.
And so when we speak of a tree as a thing which is it's under the genus of living things and things with a vegetative soul, so it grows and reproduces, and it has leaves, and it takes in sunlight and soaks up nutrients from the soil, etc., etc. It has bark and all that jazz. We speak truthfully about a tree, but if we say that a tree is something that has feelings, and it can reason, and it has an immortal soul that should be respected just as much as any other human, just as much as a human person, then our mind is moving out of accordance with reality. So when we start from a position of not knowing the truth about things and assigning to things definitions which actually don't correspond to the reality of their nature, then, just as Aquinas says in the beginning of De Ente et Essentia, small errors in the beginning lead to large ones in the conclusion.
Right.
And so if we start off with a poor understanding of what things are, and giving them terms which do not really correspond to the reality of the world, then when we start making judgments or reasoning, then our judgments and reasoning are going to be very, very far off, and even lead to really terrible conclusions.
Right. So we're gonna do a little exercise here to kind of hit the point home with the Trivium, and John has no idea what I'm gonna do.
Absolutely
because
not. I'm used to it.
We didn't do that. We didn't do this part for show prep. John.
Okay.
Can you define very simply John? Just define the term. If I say John, can you define that term?
If I say define the term John, very simply,
Yeah.
Now, question for you. Are you asking in reference to myself or in reference to the name?
Well, yourself.
Myself.
Yeah.
All right. Obviously, this is going to be very difficult because I am very great. Many things must be said about me. Kidding, of course. If I were to define myself, I would say that I am a rational animal, therefore a man, who is created in the image and likeness of God. And
You're getting way ahead of me here.
Am I getting way ahead of here?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I'm walking down the street and I'm driving or whatever, and I think, well, I need to talk to John.
Sure.
Then in my mind, I'm assigning.
What is your intention?
The image, let's say, of you, of your face, of your being with the name John.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, we are associating with the name John.
Right.
I suppose if I were to define myself in terms of like how you're going to refer to me, if I reverse and think of when I think of Jake, I normally think of Jake as my best friend. I think of Jake as
a weirdo. So sweet.
I know, right? Love you, Jakey. Think of him as that guy with the beard, the guy my wife thought looked like the devil when we first met. The guy who do a lot of youth ministry. So there's a lot of I understand you first of all as man, as a person, and then also as male. Mm-hmm. And then I think about all these different ways that we have this relationship together that distinguishes you from other people.
Okay. So when you think Jake, you think of basically the image of me. You're assigning the word Jake or the name Jake to my being.
Sure.
Okay. Can you, in, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 words, define another word for me? Man.
Man?
Yeah.
Or you're defining man?
Yeah.
In other words than what we normally use?
Well, just man. What does it mean to be man?
Well,
human.
Okay, simply to say it to be rational animal.
Okay.
Is what the
and if we look at the sexes, man would have the quality of masculinity.
Yes.
Okay. So we have John or Jake, right? We define that in terms of grammar. We have man or human or woman. Man being a rational animal with masculinity, woman being a rational animal with femininity. And so we have our grammar down.
Sure.
Okay. Well, the next step is logic.
Okay.
The second arm of the Trivium is logic. And logic is kind of the taking various parts of grammar and putting them together in a logical sequence. Not to use the word to define the term, but if I were then to say, well, I have this image of John in my mind, right? I think John, because I want to call him, I want to talk to him about the radio show, I want to talk to him about youth ministry or whatever else, or refute to his wife that in fact I'm not the devil, but then I can logically say, because I know John and I know my definition of man, I can say John is a man.
Yep.
Right?
I am a man.
You are a man.
I'm almost the exemplar of what it means to be a man.
Right.
I know you people out there in Radio Land can't see me, but you would be intimidated by my masculinity.
I don't think I would call you the exemplar.
I'm like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast.
I'm thinking more like Jesus is the exemplar.
But, oh yeah, you're probably right about that one. I mean, that is what the church teaches anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so logic is taking the truths of the world that we know and understand through grammar and putting them together in a sequence to bring together a sentence, let's say. John is a man.
Sure.
Okay. Well, what if we want to know more, right? We have John as a man. Okay, well, let's pull together some more grammar here. What does it mean to be mortal?
Mortal means that a mortal thing is something that can corrupt. It can lose its substance or essence.
Sure. It can corrupt and
cease to exist.
It can die.
Yep.
Of course, with humanity, we don't cease to exist when we die. We have an immortal soul. But our bodies will decay. And corrupt. So mortality is losing existence.
Sure.
Okay.
In some way, yeah.
In some way. Immortality is not losing existence. So let's bring our logic and our grammar now. Let's continue on in this. Are men mortal?
I think so. Anything composed of parts can be divided, and if a thing can be divided, then it is at least potentially mortal.
So man as a rational animal is mortal.
Yep,
At least the animal part of it. Our souls are rational and they carry on forever. But let's just, in this world, the man is a rational animal. He is, in fact, mortal. Mm-hmm. Are all men mortal?
Yep, if the definition of man is rational animal and all things composed of parts are divisible and animality is something that is composed of parts, in all cases, then it would follow that, yes, all animals are mortal. Man being mortal would also, man being an animal would mean that he's mortal.
Great. So we're going to pause from our little exercise here because the second part of the trivium, that being logic, corresponds to the second act of the mind, which would be what, John?
That would be judgment. And so being able to say something about something else. And so when we say that man is mortal, we take two terms and show that there's a relationship between them.
Okay. So we take, like we were just saying, we take various parts of our grammar, various terms that we've defined, putting them together, we make the judgment that A is B or A is not B, right? Okay. So then with logic and this idea of judgment of the mind, we comprehend, then we judge. So we have our grammar, then we have our logic, and that has to be directed somewhere.
Right.
It doesn't do us any good to just say, an apple is red, a tree is that thing, a dog is a dog. Like, we can't just go through the world and just have all kinds of logic without it being directed towards some good. And that's what we would call rhetoric. Rhetoric is the third act, or the third study in the Trivium. It's making a cogent argument. It's taking our grammar, it's taking our logic, and directing it towards a particular good. And so let's go back to our example. I'm sure at this point John knows where I'm going with this. John is a man. We have our grammar, we have our logic. Let's take another, what we'll call premise. All men are mortal. Okay, we have our grammar and logic. What if we put those together? What's our outcome? What would be our rhetoric?
The outcome would be, therefore, John is mortal.
Right. John is a man, all men are mortal, therefore John is mortal.
Absolutely.
He sometimes would argue otherwise. He wishes to think that he is immortal, that his body will go on forever, but that's a discussion for another day. But the Trivium seeks to form our mind to reality. It recognizes the truth of the world, it forms it in a logical way, so that we can then output into the world what that truth is. In one way we might summarize it as grammar is input, logic is formation, and rhetoric is output. And so it all has to do with information. We take the information in, we form it into a logical sequence, and then we output it back into the world to formulate our argument towards a particular end or a particular good. How does this correlate to the third act of the mind?
Of reasoning?
Yes.
Yes. Reasoning is taking things like our proposition, all men are mortal, John is a man, therefore John is immortal. Excuse me. And what we've done there is we have three terms. We have man, we have mortal, and we have John. And the two terms are... The two terms that we're really examining are John and mortal. Do they relate? And by associating mortality with manhood and associating John with, or identifying John with manhood as well, we constitute something called a middle term. In the middle term, what it does is it finds the common essence to join two things together. And so when you have mortality when you have mortality and John both referring to something that relates to man, then there is very often a correlation between those two, and from that you can see that there's a connection between mortality and John, and so we can say therefore that John is mortal. No, of course, with the ways the rules of logic work, the terms have to be properly distributed and they have to be worded in the right way or understood in the right way. Otherwise, you might get something like all men are mortal. No angel is a man. all angels are mortal, and then we can say that all angels are men, or whatever it might be, and that's not the case.
Right.
And so what we did there is we had undistributed middle, and so we didn't actually distribute the terms correctly.
Right.
So that can be a problem, and so you have to make sure that that you're following the rules of logic, which are, I think, I'm not going to say inborn with us. There's a certain amount that's synderesis. It's having that understanding of first principles that's contained kind of in our soul, kind of like a computer program, computer which doesn't have anything on it, but it has an operating system by which it can actually store information. So we have that in our souls as rational animals. But again, when we start with something that is very well known to us, we know these things. We know that there has to be some sort of actual connection.
Right.
But it's very hard for us to always put our finger on exactly what that means when we know something very, very well, or very clearly, very obviously. And so when it comes to logic, one of the beauties of studying logic is you understand the system of reasoning and the way that we reason as humans more fully, which allows us to take our judgments of the worlds in the term and see how they relate to things that we might not know through experience, which is how we start all of our knowledge.
Right, so we have the 3 acts of the Trivium, which would be grammar as the first one, logic as the second one, and rhetoric as the third. And these correspond quite nicely to the 3 acts of the mind, being apprehension, or comprehension, I guess, however you want to say that, judgment, and then reasoning. This also, again, corresponds to the 3 ways of philosophy to some degree, in that the first is an internal benefit of forming our heart, that is, forming our grammar, so to speak. The second benefit, it doesn't quite correspond perfectly, but I think it's a nice roadmap for us, that the second benefit is external. Well, we can't really deal well with the external world if we don't have some logical conformity to it. And then the third being an adequate anthropology. And that's, I think, one of the most important things in here, corresponding to the third part of the Trivium, which is rhetoric. And even the term rhetoric has a really negative connotation today, in that, the president's rhetoric is negative and all this stuff. And we hear the term rhetoric in terms of basically how can somebody spin the truth. And that's really kind of anti-rhetoric.
It is. That's sophistry, not
right.
Philosophy.
It's sophistry. It's anti-rhetoric. It's not true philosophy.
It's anti-reason.
True rhetoric is a fruit of conforming our minds to reality. It's having the humility of that, we're in Lent, so from ash we are made, and to ash we will return, or from dust we come, and to dust we will return. To have a humility that our minds ought to conform to what's real, because God created reality. He created the universe. And so we have a duty and obligation to conform our minds to that, not to create some other reality, some alternative fact, so to speak, some alternative reality. So I think for the last bit of our hour today, I think it'd be good to come back to this a little bit and really look at the practical application, maybe tie it all together with, we have grammar, logic, rhetoric. We have trying to understand the world, the human person. We have apprehension, judgment, and reasoning. How does this all tie together with the moralistic, therapeutic deist?
Well, I think that it's important to remember the concept of that which is first in intention is last in execution. And so when it comes to our moral life, if we're supposed to ultimately live by the truth of the world, and our rhetoric in terms of classical philosophy is more about trying to understand the world better through reasoning about things we already know, then the way this relates to moralistic therapeutic deism is we look again at the way rhetoric is spoken of in our culture. We hear about the president's rhetoric, which stirs up certain emotions and all that stuff. And the purpose of rhetoric in our culture is supposed to be about motivating the passions to be excited, whereas rhetoric in I think classical thought is about motivating the person to choose the reasonable thing.
Well, it's motivating the mind to engage with reality.
Right. And so I think that there is a fundamental disconnection between the very beginnings of how we think about the world and how we're ending up with these two different definitions of rhetoric, these two different understandings of rhetoric. Whereas very often in our culture we think of ourselves as not much more than animal, and therefore our passions are primarily what drive us, or primarily what we are trying to make an end of. When we start with that understanding, then what we end up with is, like Jake was saying, it's rhetoric that can often be inflammatory, or it's rhetoric that can be about stirring up the passions. But if we understand in the beginning that we're supposed to be moving towards truth and the reality of things in the world as it is, then when we come to that last stage of the act of the mind, we'll be working with this reality rather than simply our own self-expression. And with moralistic therapeutic deism, what I see here is an act of self-worship. We start with an understanding that if we are moralistic therapeutic deists, and that God generally wants us to be happy, and that He mostly has a standoffish approach to the world and is there to comfort us when we need Him, then our understanding of God is ultimately that God is like a gigantic us. God is a gigantic human with like superpower or whatever, who is that as C.S. Lewis puts it, that old grandfather up in heaven who just wants everybody to have a good time. Right. And in reality, what happens is we start making God in our own image instead of trying to realize the image of God that's already in us. And so we reverse the order of creation, the order of reality. When we have this kind of understanding of the world, what we start understanding about God is that God ultimately agrees with whatever I agree with. And this is one thing I find very fascinating. I had a conversation with somebody, I don't remember all the details, but at some point they said that something along the lines of, like, your argument makes a lot of sense, but the thing is, the God that I believe in just doesn't believe that. And I say, wait, how do you know what God believes if you don't have any, I was talking to the Christian here, if you don't have any scriptural evidence for it, if you don't have any traditional evidence for it, nothing in the Fathers, and no philosophical reason to believe that. And then she just said that, well, it's just what I believe. And we're like, what do you mean with that? That's what you believe? Well, I believe in this proposition she was making. I don't remember if it was either about gay marriage or abortion or something along those lines. And she said, and I just couldn't believe in a God that doesn't think that way or doesn't agree with me on this. And I'm just thinking about this. Oh my gosh! If that's how you understand God, then the reality is again that you are God and you're just projecting this onto some reality that you're making up under your own image. And so the way these three acts of the mind relate to the moralistic therapeutic deism is we're starting again from the very beginning with an error. And then when we apply our judgment and our reasoning to it, we come to some pretty gross mistakes near the end of our process of reasoning.
I want to go back just a minute before we end talking about the difference in rhetoric between classical education and our modern world.
Sure.
Where the idea of rhetoric in our modern world is to excite the passions and kind of get people to say act or believe without really reasoning to why. Mm-hmm. And in classical education, it's really meant to excite the mind, to get the mind to think. Now, throughout history, rhetoricians are very good at using their words, and so you get the difference between a true philosopher like Aristotle and a sophist who uses fancy words in order to sound intelligent or confuse the people for their own purposes. Sure. During my different times in Rome, in the visit of the Roman Forum, There was in ancient Rome, you can walk through the ruins and all that, and on one end there's this big platform where philosophers would gather and give speeches, and that was entertainment. You'd go and listen to the rhetorician. And why? They didn't really necessarily do it in order to just incite the crowds to mob rule, to whatever. I'm sure there were some of those. But part of it was putting logic on display. Who can have the most logical argument? It was, and you'd get one after the other after the other. And we do it now with comics, right? Like you see different comics come on stage and they do their act and everything. But in ancient Rome, you would get different rhetoricians who would come on stage basically and give their argument for whatever the topic may be. And of course, I'm not here to glorify the ancient Romans and how they did things. But I think there was a certain level of trying to incite the mind more than what we really have today when it comes to rhetoric. Again, the Romans had their fair share of people who were sophists and just try to speak eloquently because they wanted to appear smart, just like we have today all over Washington, D.C., the whole country. But politicians do this too. But in Rome, I think there was inherently a greater appreciation for those who can form logical arguments. Today, it just seems like if you form a logical argument, you're called a bigot and you're dismissed. People are not predisposed today to rhetoric, the proper idea of rhetoric and the proper idea of logic.
Right, it's used pejoratively. I think that it's also important for us to know that when it comes to rhetoric, it's not just logos, there's also ethos and pathos.
Right.
Which, those two things, the pathos is supposed to arouse the person's passions to pursue truth. And so it's to glorify and make truth a beautiful thing. And then the ethos is to show how this is lived out, give a practical application to it as well. And so, if all we did was go up and form a syllogism, it can be a perfectly valid syllogism, but for a lot of people, because we're not just angels, it's not going to necessarily incite them to motion. And so what we need to do, and this is what I do when I give talks to my kids, is I show them how this is a beautiful thing and how it matters and how it's important. And I do that with my vocal variations, my hand motions, the stories, and I appeal to them in different ways, but it's not for the sake of any end in my end that's motivated by my own selfish needs or anything, but it's for the sake of helping drive them to put value on the truth of the world.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, like you said earlier, it's you getting out of the way and kind of going back to the basis of grammar. And that's one way that I found very effective, is just going back to grammar. What do you mean by moralistic? What do you mean by therapeutic? What do you mean by deist? We've laid that out time and time again already now. But kind of going back to the grammar, getting back to the basics, and then it doesn't become about how intelligent one person is over the other. It doesn't become one person consumed with their own ends and their own purposes, but really getting back to just the idea of truth and helping people engage with that truth. And the more we can just come to understand grammar and our own ability, the better we're going to be able to help others. And so, whether or not you're in a liberal education or you've had one or you're going for one, it doesn't really matter in terms of the liberal arts. And that's, again, another one more in a long list of topics we should get to on the show.
Absolutely.
But I think, again, going back to the idea of study that we talked about last week in depth with is, do we know our grammar? Do we know what we mean by truth, by goodness, by beauty, by love, by justice, all of these things? If we don't have to read a great tome of St. Gregory. All we really have to do to get started is to start understanding terminology. And once we start to understand grammar, it's going to open up a whole wide world that we may have never known really existed. And so it's getting to be about the end of the show. John, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just think, like what you said, returning to grammar is so essential. And part of the reason for that is that we haven't really even started to do that in our world. And it's not something we think about. We don't think about the order of the mind or the order of learning quite as well as the ancients did. And of course, there's been some advances in our knowledge, but largely it's been more scientific or technological rather than moral. But these are obviously discussions that we can have in the future. In fact, a good discussion for maybe our next episode or a couple days down the line, or a couple weeks down the line, would be about the real understanding that we Christians ought to have about God and in classical theism. And for that, we're actually going to be inviting Professor Christopher Apodaca, who is a professor of philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. He's a great guy and a good friend of mine. And that's something that I think is going to be a great counterbalance to the moralistic therapeutic deism that's so prevalent in our world today. And we'll use rhetoric to show that classical theism is much more beautiful and much more useful and good than this moralistic therapeutic deism we've spoken on. But as for today, that is all. Thank you for listening to The Lost Voice. This is John Studi along with Jake Nelson signing off. Have a great day, and God bless you all.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.